So what are clock hours? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So clock hours, they're a unit of currency for continuing education in Washington State. In our state, clock hours serve in two main ways. Clock hours may be used for certification. In addition, clock hours might be eligible for salary advancement. It's important to know clock hours for salary advancement and how clock hours are used for compensation purposes. That is not set by PESB policy. So PESB, we set policy around what is a clock hour and then how clock hours are used for certification. In addition, the OSPI Certification Office accepts applications from potential clock hour providers on an annual basis. So the role of the Standards Board, PESB. So we set policy relating to clock hour providers, how clock hour providers issue clock hours, and then how these clock hours are used in certification. In addition, our board also approves clock hour providers. So the OSPI Certification Office receives the applications, they send them over to us, and then our board considers these applicants for approval. So some changes to clock hour policy. So in July 2019, our board adopted policy changes stemming from work group recommendations. And then our board reviewed and accepted the changes. And then the new policy went into place August 24th. The full policy is available in this chapter of WAC, and there's the link. So policy recommendations from our work group, they focused on flexibility and access for all educators seeking professional learning. Our work group members also looked at streamlining the system. Are there some overly burdensome processes? Things that are unnecessary that we'd streamline a bit, but at the same time, our work group members were very clear and our board was very clear that accountability was important. We also looked at standards for clock hours. So here, this information is new. So this is around flexibility and access for educators. So we will now accept continuing education units, that's CEUs, as well as PDUs and other non-credit bearing units from accredited colleges and universities, whether in-state or out-of-state, as clock hours. Credits from these same institutions are already accepted. It's important to note, if you get CEUs just from some organization that happens to be somewhere, it's not a Washington State approved clock hour provider, and it's not an accredited college or university. Those CEUs may not be used. Another change. We will now accept continuing education hours, and these were previously called STARS hours, from the Washington Department of Children, Youth, and Families, that's DCYF. Another new change, which really increased flexibility and access, all educators, not just ESAs, may now use hours which satisfy specific Department of Health licensure requirements as clock hours for continuing education. Another change, reducing the minimum time from 3 hours to 1 hour. And these are things for which clock hours may not be offered. So clock hours may not be offered for individuals serving as the instructor for a course for which that individual is the only participant. All right, other items for which clock hours may not be offered. Routine staff meetings or business meetings of professional associations, or social hours or actual mealtime. Now we're going to look at approval of clock hour courses. So how does that work? There's local approval by clock hour providers of clock hour courses. And that local approval, there is a local clock hour committee organized by a designated administrator for the clock hour provider. So at the state level, we approve the providers, but it's at the local level that clock hour courses are approved. So approval of clock hour courses. All right, this slide is very important. It has the main information on it for how local courses are approved. All right, here's the first word, prior. And that's very important. These things must happen before the course is offered. So prior to offering a course, the local clock hour committee must approve the date of the course or the date range of the course. A course cannot be offered for any time, infinitely in advance. And Approval of clock hour providers happens on an annual basis. This means that clock hour providers may not approve courses beyond essentially their validity period. If you know that a clock hour course is going to be offered, say, spring semester, it's fine to approve it for a certain date range, that spring semester or quarter or however it works, but you can't approve it for any range. The number of clock hours being offered must also be approved in advance. You can't write down something like however many hours it takes for the educator. No. All right, you must approve clock hour courses for a very specific number of hours. Then, course objectives and program agenda. So the objectives, what will the participants learn? The program agenda, what are you planning? What are the types of activities they're going to be used? Course description. Instructors and their qualifications must be approved. It's up to the local clock hour provider to determine that the instructor has the appropriate qualifications, but that clock hour committee needs to review the instructor qualifications prior to the course. And then, what is the relation of this course to the clock hour standards? Also important. Clock hours may not be issued retroactively. You can't have someone say, oh, I forgot to register. Can I register now for that course that happened last week? Now, can you have your registration material out at the door of the classroom and have your registration set up as the participants walk in prior to offering the course? Yes, that's okay. It can be immediately prior. In addition, courses must be approved prior to being offered. Providers must keep records of this. And yes, maybe there was this great class last week or last month at the school, and these 5 teachers attended that great class last week. However, if that class was not approved prior to it being offered, it may not be approved retroactively. So what is this clock hour committee? So each local clock hour provider is required to have a clock hour committee. Each clock hour provider must have a designated administrator and then the committee. Who's on the committee? The committee will be composed of individuals. Notice that's plural. It cannot be one person. Who may include? So you have some flexibility here, and here you have some suggestions on the representatives on the committee. Also important, and also please note, this is not new policy. We are reiterating current policy. All clock hour providers, no exceptions, must meet these standards. Here's how that becomes important. Sometimes we will have Washington State approved clock hour providers who will partner with another organization that is offering professional learning of some type. When partnering with that other organization, an approved clock hour provider cannot provide blanket approval of all the offerings from that third-party organization. So each course, each instructor must be approved individually. All right, so the clock hour content standards. There were very few changes to these standards. We changed the wording a bit. The only substantive change was that we now included the paraeducator standards of practice. So when approving a course, the local clock hour provider needs to say, yep, this course relates to, standard 3, 5, and 8, or whatever the particular standards are. So clock hour course evaluations. So clock hour providers are required, absolutely required, to provide course evaluations to the participants and, to the extent possible, collect these evaluations. But we also want to make sure you know that this is a state-level policy. At the individual clock hour provider level, individual clock hour providers may require that the individual submits their evaluation prior to earning the clock hours. Then, what happens with these evaluations? So the designated administrator, that's the designated administrator of the clock hour provider, must periodically report summaries of evaluations to the clock hour committee. The summaries of evaluations must also be available to OSPI staff for review. This is not new policy. This is policy that's been in place for many years. All right, so what needs to be on the evaluations? First, know that these are the minimum requirements. So the extent to which the objectives of that clock hour course have been met And those are the individual objectives for that individual course. Then, participant perception of relevance and quality of the course. And look at C for a second. The extent to which the activities identified in the clock hour standards addressed by the course have been met. So what this is, that relates to these standards here. And then that to make sure that the extent to which the course provides the opportunity for participants to reflect on next steps or the implementation of their learning. So that's new in WAC, so you want to review your evaluations. And then suggestions for improving the course if repeated. So how do you become a Washington State approved clock hour provider? So first off, which organizations are even eligible? Now, school districts are considered to be approved clock hour providers and do not need to apply, but they do need to follow all the regulations in WAC. So it is an annual application. And again, I provided you the link earlier. The next deadline to apply is August 20th of 2020. It is important not to miss that deadline. If you miss that deadline, you will not be an approved provider for the upcoming year. In addition, something that's new, applicants must describe how they will meet the program standards and record-keeping requirements in their annual application, and OSPI has developed some prompts around that. Required record keeping. So providers are required to keep the following for 7 years. And that's documentation that the committee approved the course. Clock hour providers must keep those records for 7 years. This is not a policy change. These record keeping requirements have been in place for several decades now. Clock hour providers are required to keep summaries of course evaluations and minutes showing that the committee reviewed these evaluations. Then these records must be available, so the clock hour providers must make these records available for inspection by OSPI upon request for 7 years following the course. All right, so what about clock hour providers and educators? So it's the providers who must keep that participant registration list. And then upon request, those providers must provide the clock hour documentation to participants. So if you have an individual who's taken one of your approved clock hour courses, you are required as a clock hour provider to come back to offer the individual that clock hour documentation for 7 years following completion of the course. And also, clock hour providers must give participants specific instructions regarding their need to retain clock hour documentation. If you are using OSPI Form 1125 as your clock hour form, it has this information on it. So record keeping for educators. So the educators themselves must retain their own records of clock hours for any audit of the individual educator conducted by OSPI. How long do educators need to keep these records? Educators need to keep these records for 1 year after the lapse date of the certificate or until audited by OSPI, whichever is earlier. We have this slide deck available for your use. We have an email template on clock hour changes for you to modify and share. So you might consider using some of this text in newsletters, in your organizational newsletters, or in your communications with educators. We also have a printable one-pager if you're going to a meeting, want to pass something out on clock hour providers. We have highlights of clock hour policy information available on our website. We also encourage you to join us in other ways. You can join us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook. Sign up for our newsletters. We send out newsletters after our board meetings on policy changes and on program and event information. Sign up for our newsletter.